2 days after the 2020 presidential election, as votes were still being tallied, Donald Trump's eldest son texted then White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows that "we have operational control" to ensure his father would get a second term, with Republican majorities in the U.S. Senate and swing state legislatures, CNN has learned. In the text, which has not been previously reported, Donald Trump Jr. lays out ideas for keeping his father in power by subverting the Electoral College process. According to the message reviewed by CNN, the text is among records obtained by the House Select Committee investigating January 6, 2021. Women and children targeted in Ukraine train station missile strike. Donald Trump Jr.'s texts to then White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows have emerged. It's very simple. Mr. Trump Jr. texted to Mr. Meadows on November 5, adding later in the same missive, "We have multiple paths. We control them all." In a statement to CNN, Mr. Trump Jr.'s lawyer Alan S. Futafars said, "After the election, Don received numerous messages from supporters and others. Given the date, this message likely originated from someone else and was forwarded." Immediately before his text to Mr. Meadows describing multiple paths for challenging the election, Mr. Trump Jr. texted Mr. Meadows the following: "This is what we need to do, please read it and please get it to everyone that needs to see it because I'm not sure we're doing it." November 5 text message outlines a strategy that is nearly identical to what allies of the former president attempted to carry out in the months that followed. Mr. Trump Jr. makes specific reference to filing lawsuits and advocating recounts to prevent certain swing states from certifying their results, as well as having a handful of Republican state houses put forward slates of fake Trump electors. Sydney train narrowly misses commuters. Before the election had even been called for Joe Biden, Donald Trump's family and supporters were working to overturn the results. If all that failed, according to the Mr. Trump Jr. text, GOP lawmakers in Congress could simply vote to reinstall Mr. Trump as president on January 6. "We have operational control. Total leverage," the message reads. "Moral high ground POTUS must start second term now." The text from Mr. Trump Jr. is revealing on a number of levels. It shows how those closest to the former president were already exchanging ideas for how to overturn the election months before January 6 insurrection and before all the votes were even counted. It would be another 2 days before major news outlets declared Joe Biden the winner on November 7. The text also adds to a growing body of evidence of how Mr. Trump's inner circle was actively engaged in discussing how to challenge the election results. On March 28, Judge David Carter, a federal judge in California, said that Mr. Trump, along with conservative lawyer John Eastman, launched an unprecedented campaign to overturn a Democratic election, calling it a coup in search of a legal theory. George Terwilliger, an attorney for Mr. Meadows, declined to comment for this story. A spokesperson for the House Select Committee declined to comment. Foreshadowing the Trump campaign strategy. In the weeks following the 2020 election, Mr. Trump and his allies eventually filed more than 60 unsuccessful lawsuits in key states, failing to convince the courts that his claims about a stolen election were justified or uncover any evidence of widespread voter. They also called for various recounts based on those same unfounded voter claims. A number of states conducted recounts in the months after the election, though none of them revealed any substantial enough to have changed the outcome of the vote in any state. While Mr. Trump Jr. was publicly pushing various voter conspiracy theories and generally casting doubt about the results in states like Pennsylvania and Georgia, his text to Mr. Meadows reveals there were other ideas being discussed privately. Donald Trump Jr. campaigned for the 2020 election to be overturned in his father's favor. Specifically, Mr. Trump Jr. previews a strategy to supplant authentic electors with fake Republican electors in a handful of states. That plan was eventually orchestrated and carried out by allies of the former president and overseen by his then-attorney Rudy Giuliani. In his text to Mr. Meadows, Mr. Trump Jr. identifies 2 key dates in December that serve as lines for states to certify their electoral results and compel Congress to accept them. Though the dates are largely ceremonial, in his text Mr. Trump Jr. appears to point to them as potential weaknesses to be exploited by casting doubt on the legitimacy of the election results. Seeking Trump electors. Mr. Trump Jr.'s November 5 text to Mr. Meadows came as similar notions of faithless electors were starting to percolate publicly on conservative social media. Mr. Trump Jr. sent the text to Mr. Meadows at 12:51 p.m., just minutes after conservative radio host Mark Levin had tweeted a similar idea and suggested state legislatures have final say on electors. If secretaries of state were unable to certify the results, Mr. Trump Jr. argues in his text to Mr. Meadows that they should press their advantage by having Republican-controlled state assemblies step in and put forward separate slates of Trump electors, he writes. Republicans control Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, North Carolina, etc. We get Trump electors, Mr. Trump Jr. adds. Mr. Trump Jr.'s text, however, refers to an untested legal theory that state houses are the ultimate authority in elections and can intervene to put forward a different slate of electors than those chosen by the voters, when in reality, this is a ceremonial process, and the outcome is essentially a foregone conclusion. The Justice Department and the House Committee are both investigating the fake electors plot within the context of what unfolded on January 6 and Trump's broader effort to overturn the election. The strategy floated by Mr. Trump Jr. is similar to what was outlined by former Texas Governor and Trump Energy Secretary Rick Perry, who texted Meadows on November 4 suggesting 3 state legislatures ignore the will of their voters and deliver their state's electors to Mr. Trump. Here's an aggressive strategy. Why can't the states of GA, Penn, and other controlled state houses declare this is BS and just send their own electors to vote and have it go to the SCOTUS? Mr. Perry's text message read. A spokesman for Mr. Perry told CNN at the time that the former Energy Secretary denies being the author of the text. However, multiple people who know Mr. Perry previously confirmed to CNN that the phone number the committee has associated with that text message is Mr. Perry's number. Capitol fenced off after day of chaos. We control them all. Mr. Trump Jr. also texts Mr. Meadows that Congress could intervene on January 6 and overturn the will of voters if, for some reason, they were unable to secure enough electoral votes to tip the outcome in Mr. Trump's favor using the state-based strategy. That option, according to Mr. Trump Jr.'s text, involves a scenario where neither Mr. Biden nor Mr. Trump have enough electoral votes to be declared a winner, prompting the House of Representatives to vote by state party delegation, with each state getting 1 vote. Republicans control 28 states, Democrats 22 states, Mr. Trump Jr. texts. Once again Trump wins. We either have a vote WE control, and WE win or it gets kicked to Congress the 6th of January 2021, he texts Mr. Meadows. In a series of memos in early January, conservative lawyer John Eastman proposed a variation of that idea. Drive Eastman's memo laid out a 6-step plan for Vice President Mike Pence to overturn the election for Mr. Trump, which included throwing out the results in 7 states because they allegedly had competing electors. In fact, no state had actually put forward an alternate slate of electors. There were merely Mr. Trump allies claiming without any authority to be electors. Drive Eastman, who has been subpoenaed by the House Select Committee and is fighting to keep some of his records secret from investigators, was accused by Mr. Carter of likely engaging in a criminal conspiracy with Mr. Trump to overturn the election. Drive Eastman has an unblemished record as an attorney and respectfully disagrees with the judge's findings, his attorney Charles Burnham said in response to the judge's ruling. Trump Jr. pushes Meadows to fire Wray and install loyalist at FBI. Mr. Trump Jr. ends his November 5 text by calling for a litany of personnel moves to solidify his father's control over the government by putting loyalists in key jobs and initiate investigations into the Biden family. Fire Wray, fire Fauci, he texts, referring to FBI Director Christopher Wray and White House coronavirus advisor Anthony Fauci. Mr. Trump Jr. then proposes making former acting director of national intelligence, Rick Grenell, interim head of the FBI, and having then Attorney General Bill Barr select special prosecutor.